The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the dusty boarding house in Westcliffe, Colorado, and Florence Pritchard stepped down wearing a dress that did not belong to her, borrowed from a woman she would never see again, with nothing to her name but a battered carpet bag and a letter of introduction to a man she had never met. It was June of 1882, and the mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Florence smoothed the wrinkled blue calico fabric of her borrowed dress, feeling the worn threads beneath her fingers. The dress had belonged to Mrs. Henderson, a kind widow from Kansas City who had taken pity on Florence after hearing her story. That story was not one Florence cared to repeat, but the essentials were simple enough. Orphaned at 22 when influenza took both her parents within a week of each other, left with debts that consumed everything the family had owned, and faced with the choice of accepting an unwanted marriage proposal from a cruel merchant twice her age or striking out west to make a new life. She had chosen the West. The letter in her bag was from her late mother's cousin, a woman named Agnes who ran a respectable boarding house in Westcliffe and had written that she could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It was not much, but it was honest work and a fresh start, and Florence was grateful for both. The main street of Westcliffe stretched before her, lined with wooden buildings that seemed to lean against the mountain wind. She could see a general store, a saloon with its doors propped open, a blacksmith shop with smoke rising from the chimney, and various other establishments that marked a frontier town working hard to become something more civilized. The wet mountain valley spread out around the town, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising majestically to the west, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer season. Florence picked up her carpet bag and started toward the boarding house. A group of cowboys rode past, their horses kicking up dust that settled on her already travel-worn dress. She tried not to think about how she must look, tried to hold her head high despite feeling like an imposter in borrowed clothes. The boarding house was a two-story structure painted white with green shutters. A sign hung above the porch. Agnes Morrison's boarding house, clean rooms, good meals. Florence climbed the steps and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was thin and severe-looking, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes swept over Florence with an expression that made Florence's stomach sink. "Yes," the woman said. "I am looking for Mrs. Agnes Morrison," Florence said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am Florence Pritchard, her cousin's daughter." The woman's expression did not soften. "Agnes Morrison passed 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia took her sudden-like." The world seemed to tilt beneath Florence's feet. "Oh," she managed to say, "I did not know. I am so very sorry." "Are you the girl from back east she mentioned, the one who was supposed to help her?" "Yes, madam." The woman shook her head. "Well, there is nothing here for you now. I bought the boarding house from her estate. I run it myself with my daughters." Florence stood frozen on the porch, her last hope crumbling like sun-dried clay. She had spent nearly all her money on the stagecoach ticket. She had perhaps $3 left to her name. "I understand," Florence said quietly. "Thank you for telling me." She turned and walked back down the steps, her mind racing. $3 would get her a room for perhaps 2 nights if she was lucky and a few meals. Then what? She could not go back east. There was nothing to go back to. Florence walked along the main street, looking at each building with new eyes. The general store might need help. The restaurant at the end of the street might hire a waitress. She would ask everywhere, take any honest work, no matter how humble. She was so lost in her desperate thoughts that she nearly collided with a man coming out of the general store. "Pardon me, miss," he said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. Florence looked up and found herself meeting the bluest eyes she had ever seen. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers with a leather vest. His hat was pushed back, revealing dark blonde hair and a face that was handsome in a rugged, sun-weathered way. He appeared to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. "The fault was mine," Florence said. "I was not watching where I was going." He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "New in town, I have not seen you before, and I know most folks in Westcliffe. I arrived just now on the stage. I was coming to stay with my cousin, but I have just learned she passed away." The smile faded, replaced by genuine concern. "Agnes Morrison, you knew her." "Everyone knew Agnes. She was a good woman. I am sorry for your loss." He paused, studying Florence's face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow did not. "Are you all right? Do you have somewhere to stay?" Florence straightened her shoulders, pride warring with desperation. "I will find something. There must be work in town." "There might be," he said slowly. "What kind of work are you looking for? Anything honest? I can cook and clean and sew. I can read and write and do figures. I am not afraid of hard work." He was quiet for a moment, and Florence had the strange sense that he was making some kind of important decision. Finally, he said, "My name is Quincy Turner. I own a ranch about 5 miles outside town. The Cross T Ranch." "Florence Pritchard," she replied. "Miss Pritchard, this is going to sound mighty forward, and I hope you will not take offense, but I have a proposition for you." Florence tensed, suddenly wary. She had heard such propositions before, and they were never respectable. Quincy must have seen something in her expression, because he quickly added, "Not that kind of proposition. Nothing improper. I need a wife." Of all the things Florence had expected him to say, that was not among them. She stared at him, speechless. "I know how that sounds," Quincy continued, speaking quickly now. "But hear me out. I have been running my ranch alone for 2 years since my mother passed. I need someone to help manage the household, and frankly, I need a wife. This town is small, and there are not many unmarried women. I have been thinking about advertising for a mail-order bride, but that seems like asking for trouble, marrying someone you have only known through letters. And you think marrying someone you met 5 minutes ago on the street is better?" Florence asked, finding her voice. He had the grace to look sheepish. "When you put it that way, it does sound foolish. But here is the thing. You need a place to stay and honest work. I need a wife and help with my ranch. We could help each other." "You do not know anything about me," Florence said. "I know you are Agnes Morrison's kin, and that speaks well of you. I know you are willing to work hard, which is more than I can say for some. And I know you are in a difficult situation and could use some help." He looked directly into her eyes. "I am not a bad man, Miss Pritchard. I do not drink to excess, I do not gamble, and I do not raise my hand to women or animals. I own my ranch free and clear, and I make a decent living. I would treat you with respect and kindness." Florence's mind was spinning. This was madness, absolute madness. She could not marry a man she had just met on the street. But what were her alternatives? She could try to find work in town, but even if she did, it would likely pay barely enough for a room and meals. She would be alone, vulnerable, and struggling. At least as Quincy Turner's wife, she would have a home and security. "Why me?" she asked. "You could ask any woman in town. Like I said, there are not many unmarried women here. The few that are available are either too young or already being courted by other men. And there is something about you." He paused, searching for words. "When I look at you, I see someone strong, someone who has been through hardship but has not let it break her. I respect that." Florence looked down at her borrowed dress, at the dust on her worn boots, and felt the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her. Then she looked back up at Quincy Turner, at his honest blue eyes and open face, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "I want to be clear about expectations. Would this be a marriage in name only, or would you expect other things?" Quincy's ears turned slightly red. "I would expect it to be a real marriage eventually, but I am not the kind of man who would force anything. We would take our time, get to know each other. I would give you your own room if you wanted it, at least at first. And if it does not work, if we find we cannot stand each other, then I suppose we would have made a mistake," Quincy said honestly. "But I am willing to take that chance if you are." Florence took a deep breath. "I would want to see the ranch first, and I would need a few days to think about it." "Of course," Quincy said quickly, "but—" He hesitated. "Where are you planning to stay while you think about it?" That was the question, was it not? Florence bit her lip. "I have enough money for a room for a night or two." "Stay at the ranch," Quincy said. "There is plenty of room. You can have the guest bedroom and you can see what the place is like. If you decide you do not want to marry me, I will bring you back to town and help you find work. You have my word on that." It was improper, of course. A young, unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's ranch. But Florence was learning that desperation had a way of making propriety seem less important. "All right," she said. "I will come see the ranch." Quincy's face lit up with a smile that made him look boyish. "Good. Excellent. I need to finish my business in town, but I can pick you up in an hour. Will that give you enough time to— well, to do whatever you need to do?" "That will be fine," Florence said. She spent the next hour walking around Westcliffe, trying to get a sense of the town that might become her home. She stopped in at the general store, where a friendly woman named Mrs. Harper told her about the town's history. Westcliffe had been founded just a few years earlier in 1881, when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad came through. Silver mining in the nearby hills had brought prosperity and growth. "It is a good town," Mrs. Harper said. "Folks here look out for each other. Are you planning to stay?" "I might be," Florence said cautiously. When she emerged from the store, Quincy was waiting with a wagon. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands careful and respectful, and they started out of town. The ride to the Cross T Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Florence had ever seen. The road wound through the valley with mountains rising on both sides. Wildflowers dotted the grasslands, and she saw cattle grazing in the distance. "It is beautiful here," she said. "It is," Quincy agreed. "I grew up in Missouri, came out here with my parents when I was 18. My father wanted to start a ranch, make something of his own. He and my mother worked themselves near to death getting the place established. My father died 5 years ago, thrown from a horse. My mother kept the ranch going until 2 years ago when her heart gave out." "I am sorry," Florence said. "I lost my parents recently too, both to influenza." "Then we both know what it is like to be alone," Quincy said quietly. They rode in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. Florence watched the landscape roll past and tried to imagine herself living here, tried to picture a life with this man she barely knew. The Cross T Ranch appeared as they crested a hill. The main house was a solid log structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and several other outbuildings. Everything looked well maintained, the result of hard work and care. "It is not fancy," Quincy said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it is sturdy and well built." Inside, the house was clean but sparse. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. There was a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, a few cabinets, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. Everything was functional and masculine, the home of a man living alone. "The guest bedroom is through here," Quincy said, leading her to a small room off the main area. It contained a simple bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a trunk. It was my mother's sewing room, but I moved a bed in after she passed in case I had visitors. It is very nice, Florence said. Quincy showed her the rest of the house. There was his bedroom, larger than the guest room and containing a big bed that had belonged to his parents. There was a root cellar for storage and a back porch with a pump for water. I have about 200 head of cattle, Quincy explained as they walked around the property. I run them on open range mostly, but bring them in closer during winter. I have 6 horses, chickens for eggs, a couple of pigs. I grow some vegetables in a garden plot behind the house, though I admit I am not much of a gardener. You run the ranch alone? Florence asked. Mostly. I hire a couple of cowboys during roundup and branding time, and sometimes for help with the hay harvest. But day to day, it is just me. Florence could see what he meant about needing help. Running a ranch this size alone would be exhausting work. They returned to the house and Quincy said, "I should let you rest. You must be tired from your journey. I will make us some supper in a bit." "I can cook," Florence offered, "if you would like." "I would not want to put you to work before you have even decided to stay," Quincy said. "I want to do it," Florence said. "Let me see what you have, and I will make us a meal." What Quincy had was the larder of a bachelor who ate to survive rather than for pleasure. Florence found some salt pork, beans, flour, and a few sad-looking vegetables from his garden. She also found a jar of canned tomatoes and some dried herbs that looked like they had been there since his mother's time. She set to work, and Quincy watched her with an expression of fascination, as if he could not quite believe she was real. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked. "From my mother. She said every woman should know how to make a good meal from whatever was available. During the war, when I was small, we often did not have much. She got very creative." "You would have been just a baby during the war," Quincy said. "I was born in 1860, so I do not remember much of it. But I remember the hard years after when my father was trying to rebuild his business." Florence stirred the pot of beans she had set to simmering. "What about you? How did you manage during the war?" "My family stayed in Missouri through most of it. That was hard country to be in during those years with border raiders and bushwhackers. My father was too old to fight, but we lost neighbors and friends. I was just a boy, but I remember the fear." Quincy leaned against the door frame. "When it was over, my father wanted to start fresh somewhere new. That is what brought us out here." Florence worked on making biscuits, cutting lard into flour with practiced movements. "You ever regret it, coming west instead of staying where you knew people?" "No," Quincy said without hesitation. "This land gets in your blood. The space, the freedom, the feeling that you are building something that is truly yours. Missouri was my parents' home, but Colorado is mine." They ate supper as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The meal was simple but good, and Quincy ate with the enthusiasm of a man who had been living on his own poor cooking for too long. "This is the best meal I have had in 2 years," he said, sopping up bean juice with a biscuit. "If nothing else convinces you to stay, I hope my desperate need for decent food might do it." Florence found herself smiling. "I have had many marriage proposals in my life, but that might be the most honest one." "You have had many proposals?" Quincy asked, then quickly added, "I am sorry, that is none of my business." "It is all right. There were a few back home, but none from men I wanted to marry. And one from a man my father owed money to after my parents died. He offered to forgive the debt if I would marry him." "What was wrong with him?" "He was cruel. I saw how he treated his workers, his animals. I would rather have faced debtor's prison than married him." "Good," Quincy said firmly. "A man who is cruel to those weaker than him is no man at all." After supper, they sat on the front porch and watched the stars come out. The sky was bigger here than it had been back east, vast and filled with more stars than Florence had ever seen. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. "What are your plans for it?" Quincy leaned back in his chair. "I want to build it up, increase the herd, maybe improve the quality of the cattle by bringing in better breeding stock. There is good money to be made in beef, with the railroad making it easier to ship cattle to market. And I would like to make the house more comfortable. My mother always wanted a proper parlor, separate from the kitchen, but we never quite got around to it. Why not? There was always something more urgent, a fence that needed mending, a roof that needed fixing. Ranch work never ends." He looked over at her. "What about you? What did you want before everything changed?" Florence thought about it. "I suppose I wanted what most women want. A home, a family, someone to love who loved me in return. I helped my mother with her charitable work, and I enjoyed that. Helping people who needed it gave me purpose." "There is plenty of need out here," Quincy said. "The town is growing, and there are families struggling to make a go of it. A woman with a kind heart and a willingness to help would be welcomed." They talked until the air grew cool and Florence began to shiver. Quincy immediately stood up. "I am sorry. I have kept you up talking when you must be exhausted. Let me show you where everything is, and you can get some rest." He was a perfect gentleman, showing her where the linens were kept, making sure she had water for washing, even banking the fire so the house would stay warm through the night. "If you need anything, anything at all, my room is just there," he said, pointing. "Do not hesitate to wake me." "Thank you," Florence said, "for all of this, for your kindness." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Quincy replied. "Sleep well, Florence." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it, gentle and warm, made her heart skip a beat. Florence lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the pines. She thought about Quincy's proposal, about the mad impulsiveness of marrying a stranger. But was it really so mad? People married for practical reasons all the time. Love matches were a luxury that many could not afford. At least Quincy seemed kind and honest. At least he was offering her a real home and a partnership. And there was something else, something she was almost afraid to acknowledge. When she looked at Quincy, when she heard his voice and saw the way he smiled, she felt something stir inside her. Interest. Attraction. The possibility of something more than just a practical arrangement. She fell asleep still thinking about it and dreamed of mountains and blue eyes. The next morning, Florence woke to the sound of Quincy moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her borrowed dress, wishing desperately that she had something else to wear, and went to join him. He had coffee brewing and was attempting to make breakfast with limited success. "Let me," Florence said, and he stepped aside gratefully. She made eggs and bacon and more biscuits, and they ate together in the early morning light. "I need to ride out and check on the cattle," Quincy said. "You are welcome to come with me if you like, or you can stay here and rest or explore the house and grounds, whatever you prefer." "I would like to come with you," Florence said. "If you have a horse I can ride. I have a gentle mare that should suit you. Do you ride?" "I used to when I was younger." Quincy saddled 2 horses, and they rode out across the ranch. He showed her the boundaries of his property, the best grazing areas, the creek that provided water for the cattle. He explained his operation with obvious pride and knowledge. Florence watched him as he worked, seeing the easy confidence with which he handled the animals, the way he knew every inch of his land. This was a man who had found his place in the world and was content in it. They stopped to rest by the creek, letting the horses drink. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said, "Anything. Why have you not married before now? You are a good man with a successful ranch. Surely there must have been women interested in you." Quincy was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. "There was someone, a few years back." the daughter of a rancher from the next valley over. We courted for about 6 months, and I thought we would marry. But she went back east to visit family and decided she preferred city life. She wrote me a letter saying she was sorry but she could not live out here. That must have hurt. It did. Made me wary of courting again, I suppose. I threw myself into the ranch and time passed. Then my mother got sick and I spent her last months caring for her. After she died, I was alone here and the silence was. He trailed off, then looked at Florence. I was lonely. I did not realize how lonely until yesterday when I saw you on the street and thought, there she is. The woman I have been waiting for. Florence's breath caught. You do not even know me. Maybe not the details, but I know what matters. I know you are brave to come west alone. I know you are loyal to travel all this way for family. I know you are practical to consider my proposal instead of dismissing it out of hand. And I know that when you smile, it lights up your whole face. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Florence felt heat rising in her cheeks. Quincy, she started, but he held up a hand. I am not trying to rush you. Take all the time you need to decide. I just wanted you to know that this is not just a business arrangement for me. I genuinely like you, Florence, and I think we could be happy together. They rode back to the ranch in thoughtful silence. Florence's mind was made up, she realized. Somewhere between last night's stargazing and this morning's ride, she had decided to take a chance on Quincy Turner. Back at the house, as they were unsaddling the horses, she said, I have an answer for you. Quincy froze, his hands on the saddle. Already? Yes, I will marry you. He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. Truly, truly, but I have some conditions. Name them. I want this to be a real partnership. I will not be just a housekeeper you happen to be married to. If I have opinions about the ranch or anything else, I want you to listen to them. Agreed. And I want time for us to get to know each other properly before we are fully husband and wife in every sense. Of course, I already promised you that. Then yes, Quincy Turner, I will marry you. Quincy let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses. Then, more sedately, he took Florence's hand and bowed over it formally. You have made me very happy, Miss Pritchard. I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this decision. They rode back to town that afternoon to make the arrangements. Westcliffe had a small church and a circuit preacher who came through once a month, but there was also a justice of the peace who could perform marriages. Judge Morrison, no relation to Agnes despite sharing a name, was a portly man with kind eyes. He listened to their request and looked at them both carefully. You are both of age and of sound mind, he asked. Yes, sir, they both replied. And you are entering this marriage freely without coercion. Yes, sir, Florence said firmly. Well then, I see no reason to delay. We can do the ceremony right now if you like, or you can wait and have something more formal. Florence looked at Quincy. Now is fine, she said. Judge Morrison called in his clerk and his wife to serve as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and simple. Florence stood in her borrowed blue calico dress, which suddenly felt shabby and wrong for a wedding, no matter how practical the marriage might be. Quincy must have noticed her discomfort because he squeezed her hand gently and whispered, You look beautiful. They exchanged vows and Quincy slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It was slightly too large and he frowned. It was my mother's, he said. We will get you one that fits properly. It is perfect, Florence said and meant it. Judge Morrison pronounced them man and wife, and Quincy kissed her gently on the lips. It was brief and chaste, but it sent a thrill through Florence that surprised her. They signed the marriage certificate, and just like that, Florence Pritchard became Florence Turner. On the way out of the judge's office, Quincy stopped suddenly. Wait here, he said, and ducked into the general store. He emerged a few minutes later with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I know it is not much, but I wanted you to have something for our wedding day." Florence unwrapped the package to find a length of ribbon in deep blue silk. "Quincy, you did not have to." "I wanted to. Mrs. Harper said it matches your eyes." Florence tied the ribbon in her hair, touched by the simple thoughtfulness of the gesture. They walked back to the wagon, and Florence caught sight of their reflection in the store window. A rancher and his new wife, heading home together. The first weeks of marriage were a time of adjustment for both of them. Florence threw herself into making the ranch house into a proper home. She cleaned every corner, organized the kitchen, planted herbs in the garden. Quincy watched her work with obvious appreciation, often finding excuses to come inside and talk to her. "You do not have to work so hard," he said one day, finding her scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. I want this to feel like home." "It already does," Quincy said quietly. "It has not felt like home since my mother died, but it does now." They developed a comfortable routine. Quincy rose early to tend to the animals and check on the cattle. Florence made breakfast and packed him a lunch. They would eat supper together and spend the evenings talking on the porch or by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Quincy was unfailingly respectful of the boundaries Florence had set. He gave her privacy and space, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. But Florence found herself drawn to him more each day. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands with the animals, the sound of his laugh. One evening, about 3 weeks into their marriage, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Florence said, "I need to go into town tomorrow. I cannot keep wearing the same dress every day." Quincy looked embarrassed. "I should have thought of that sooner. Of course you need clothes. Take the wagon and get whatever you need. Open an account at Harper's General Store in my name." The next morning, Florence drove the wagon into Westcliffe. Mrs. Harper greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Turner, how lovely to see you. How are you settling in at the ranch?" "Very well, thank you." "I need to look at fabric. I need to make some new dresses." Mrs. Harper showed her to the fabric section, and Florence's heart sank. The selection was limited and the prices were higher than she had expected. She calculated quickly in her head. Even being frugal, making enough dresses to have a proper wardrobe would cost more money than she felt comfortable spending. She was examining a bolt of simple brown cotton when Mrs. Harper said, "That just came in last week. It is good, sturdy fabric." "How much is it, Mrs.?" Harper quoted a price that made Florence wince. She could get by with 2 dresses, she supposed. The borrowed blue one and one new one, if she was very careful with them and washed them frequently. She was about to tell Mrs. Harper to cut enough fabric for one dress when Quincy walked into the store. "I thought you might need help carrying things," he said. "I have not bought anything yet," Florence said. Quincy looked at the single bolt of brown fabric she was holding and frowned. "Is that all you are getting?" "It is all I need for now, Florence." He said her name gently. "You need more than one new dress. I do not want to spend too much of your money." "Our money," he corrected. "And you are my wife. I want you to have the things you need." "But no buts." He turned to Mrs. Harper. "My wife will be needing fabric for several dresses. Please show her everything you have." "Quincy, this is not necessary," Florence protested. He took her hands in his. "You arrived here with nothing but a borrowed dress. Let me do this for you, please." There was something in his eyes, a need to provide for her, to take care of her, that Florence recognized. This was important to him, and if she was being honest with herself, it was important to her too. She was tired of feeling like a charity case, tired of wearing the same dress day after day. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." What followed was one of the most enjoyable afternoons Florence could remember. Mrs. Harper brought out bolts of fabric in various colors and patterns. There was a pretty green sprigged cotton, a warm brown wool for winter, a cheerful yellow calico, and several others. "Pick whatever you like," Quincy said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and a smile on his face. Florence selected fabric for 4 dresses, trying to be sensible and choose things that would wear well and be practical for ranch work. But Quincy kept adding things to the pile: ribbon for trim, buttons that were fancier than strictly necessary, lace for collars and cuffs. "Quincy, I do not need all this," she said, laughing. "Maybe not, but I want you to have it anyway." Mrs. Harper was measuring and cutting fabric, her eyes twinkling. "It is good to see someone taking care of Agnes Morrison's kin," she said. "She would have been happy to know you landed on your feet." Florence felt a pang of sadness for the cousin she had never met but who had tried to help her. "I wish I could have known her." "She was a fine woman," Mrs. Harper said, "and she would have liked Quincy. He is one of the good ones." They loaded the fabric and notions into the wagon, along with several other supplies Quincy had decided they needed. The bill must have been substantial, but Quincy paid it without blinking. As they drove back to the ranch, Florence said, "You spent too much money today." "I spent exactly the right amount of money on my wife. And before you argue, let me say something." He pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. "I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but for me, it has become something more. I care about you, Florence. Seeing you happy makes me happy. Buying you fabric for new dresses is a small thing that brings me joy. So please, let me have this joy." Florence looked at him, at the earnest expression on his face, and felt something shift inside her. This good, kind man was her husband, and he was offering her not just security but affection and care. "All right," she said. "And Quincy, it has become something more for me too." His face lit up with such pure happiness that Florence could not help herself. She leaned over and kissed him, properly this time, not a brief wedding kiss but something real and warm and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Quincy was grinning like a fool. "Well then," he said, his voice slightly unsteady, "I should buy you fabric more often." Florence laughed and swatted his arm, and they drove home with a new ease between them. A barrier crossed. Over the next week, Florence worked on sewing her new dresses. She had always been skilled with a needle, and she enjoyed the work. Quincy would come in from the ranch and find her sitting by the window, sewing in the good light, and he would smile and ask to see her progress. "You have a real talent for this," he said, examining the neat stitches on a seam. "My mother taught me well. She said a woman with a needle could always make do." The first dress she finished was the green sprigged cotton. She put it on one morning before breakfast, and when Quincy saw her, he stopped in his tracks. "Florence," he breathed, "you look stunning." She felt herself blush. "It is just a simple dress." "It is not just the dress, it is you in it. You look happy." And she was happy, Florence realized. Despite the strange circumstances of their marriage, despite how quickly everything had happened, she was genuinely happy. She had a home, work that mattered, and a husband who treated her with kindness and respect. The days grew warmer as summer deepened. Quincy worked long hours during the day, but the evenings were theirs. They would sit on the porch and talk, or sometimes Quincy would read aloud from one of the books he had inherited from his parents. Florence discovered that he had a pleasant reading voice and a love of adventure stories. One evening, about 6 weeks into their marriage, a thunderstorm rolled over the mountains. They stood on the porch watching the lightning flash across the sky, feeling the temperature drop and the first fat drops of rain begin to fall. "We should go inside," Quincy said, but neither of them moved. The storm broke in earnest, rain pouring down in sheets. Florence laughed with pure delight, holding her hands out to catch the rain. "You are going to get soaked," Quincy said, but he was laughing too. "I do not care." Florence spun around, her face turned up to the sky. Quincy caught her as she spun, and suddenly they were standing very close, rain dripping from their hair and clothes. The laughter faded as they looked at each other. "Florence," Quincy said softly. "Yes, I am falling in love with you." Her heart seemed to stop and then start again, beating faster. "I am falling in love with you too." He kissed her then, in the rain and the thunder, and it was nothing like their first chaste kiss. This was passion and promise, the beginning of something neither of them could stop even if they wanted to. They stumbled inside, still kissing, leaving a trail of water across the floor Florence had scrubbed that morning. She did not care. All she cared about was Quincy, his hands gentle on her waist, his lips on hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, pulling back slightly. "I am sure," Florence said. He led her to his room, to the big bed that had seemed so intimidating before. Now it just seemed right. Everything seemed right. Afterward they lay tangled together, listening to the rain on the roof. "I never expected this," Florence said softly. "When I got off that stage in my borrowed dress, I never imagined I would find this. Find you." "I knew," Quincy said, running his fingers through her hair. "The moment I saw you, I knew you would change my life. I just did not know how much." "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I have ever been," he said, and kissed the top of her head. They fell asleep in each other's arms as the storm passed over, leaving the air clean and fresh. The next morning, Florence woke to find Quincy already up and dressed, watching her with a soft expression. "Good morning, wife," he said. "Good morning, husband," she replied, feeling herself blush. "I have work to do, but I would much rather stay here with you." "Then stay," Florence said daringly. Quincy groaned. "You are a temptation, but the cattle will not tend themselves." He leaned down and kissed her. "Tonight, though, tonight I am all yours." Florence spent the day in a daze of happiness, going through her chores with a smile on her face. She was hanging laundry when she heard a wagon approaching. A woman about Florence's age climbed down from the wagon, followed by two small children. She was pretty in a worn way, with brown hair and tired eyes. "Hello," she called. "I am Sarah Mitchell. My husband and I have a homestead about 10 miles east of here. I heard Quincy Turner had gotten married, and I wanted to come by and introduce myself." "Florence Turner," Florence said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please come inside. I will make coffee." Sarah's children, a boy of about 4 and a girl of perhaps 2, ran around the yard while the women talked in the kitchen. "I hope I am not intruding," Sarah said. "But there are so few women out here, and I get lonely. My husband is a good man, but sometimes I just need to talk to another woman, you know." "I know," Florence said, though she had only been married a short time. "How long have you been out here?" 3 years. We came from Ohio, full of dreams about making it rich with a homestead. Reality has been harder than we expected." Sarah looked around the kitchen. "Your place is lovely. Quincy has done well for himself." They talked for over an hour, and by the time Sarah left, Florence had a new friend. Sarah invited her to a church social the following Sunday. "All the ranching families will be there," she said. "It will be a good chance for you to meet everyone." Florence mentioned the social to Quincy that evening. "We should definitely go," he said. "I have been meaning to take you to church anyway, introduce you properly to folks. I was just enjoying having you to myself, too much to share." Sunday arrived, and Florence dressed in her new yellow calico dress. Quincy wore his best suit, and they drove to town in the wagon. The church was small but well kept, and it seemed like the entire community had turned out. Florence was introduced to so many people that she knew she would never remember all the names. but everyone was friendly and welcoming. After the service, there was a potluck dinner on the church grounds. Florence had made a cake, and it was devoured quickly. Several women complimented her baking. "You must give me the recipe," one older woman said. "I have not had cake this good since I left St. Louis." Florence found herself surrounded by women eager to talk, to share news and gossip, to welcome her into their community. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. She had not realized how much she had missed female companionship. Quincy stood with a group of ranchers, but his eyes kept finding Florence across the crowd. Every time their gazes met, he would smile at her, and she would smile back, a private communication that needed no words. On the drive home, Quincy said, "You were a hit. Everyone was so kind, they like you, and why would not they? You are smart and kind and beautiful." "You are biased," Florence teased. "Absolutely," Quincy agreed cheerfully, "but that does not make it any less true." Life settled into a happy rhythm. Florence made friends in town, joined the church's ladies' auxiliary, and found purpose in helping newer families get established. She discovered she had a knack for organizing, and soon she was coordinating food deliveries to struggling families and organizing work parties to help build cabins or bring in harvests. Quincy supported her efforts completely, often donating beef or lending his labor to help others. Together, they became pillars of the growing community. As autumn approached, Quincy hired 2 cowboys to help with the fall roundup. Jack and Pete were young men from Texas, good workers who respected Florence and caused no trouble. With the extra help, Quincy spent more time on improving the ranch. He expanded the barn, built a new chicken coop, and started work on adding a proper parlor to the house, fulfilling his mother's dream. "You do not have to do this," Florence said, watching him frame up the new room. "I want to. I want our home to be comfortable and beautiful like you." Fall turned to winter, and the first snow fell on the Cross T Ranch. Florence stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the flakes drift down. Quincy came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Are you warm enough?" "I am perfect," Florence said, leaning back against him. "I have something for you," he said. "Close your eyes." Florence closed her eyes, and she heard him move away and then return. "Open them." In his hands was a dress, but not one she had made. This was a beautiful gown in deep blue velvet, with lace at the collar and cuffs, more elegant than anything Florence had ever owned. "Quincy," she gasped. "When did you? How did you?" "I sent away for it months ago to Denver. I wanted you to have something special for Christmas." "It is too much," she said, but she could not take her eyes off the beautiful dress. "It is not enough," Quincy said. "You came here with nothing but a borrowed dress. I want your closet filled with beautiful things, want you to have everything you could ever want or need." Florence looked from the dress to Quincy's face, seeing the love there, and felt tears prick her eyes. "All I need is you. You have me," he said softly. "Forever." Christmas that year was the happiest Florence could remember. They attended Christmas service in town, and Florence wore her new blue velvet dress. She saw the envious looks from other women and felt a flash of pride, not in the dress itself, but in the love that had prompted its giving. They hosted Christmas dinner at the ranch, inviting Sarah and her family and several other friends they had made. The house was filled with laughter and warmth, and as Florence looked around the table at the people gathered there, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up together, Quincy said, "This is what I always dreamed this house would be, full of life and love and friendship." "It is what I dreamed of too," Florence said. "I just did not know it until I found it." Winter passed in a blur of snow and cozy evenings by the fire. Spring brought new life to the ranch and new hope to Florence's heart. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was sure before telling Quincy. One evening in early April, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, she said, "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" Quincy asked, hearing something in her voice. "I am with child." For a moment, Quincy just stared at her. Then he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to town. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully. "I should not have done that. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you even be outside?" Florence laughed at his sudden panic. "I am fine. I am pregnant, not made of glass." But Quincy was already fussing over her, making sure she had a cushion for her back, bringing her water, asking if she was warm enough. "You are going to drive me mad with this," Florence said affectionately. "I cannot help it. You are carrying our child." Over the following months, Quincy's protectiveness reached absurd levels. He tried to prevent her from doing any heavy work, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly about her health. Florence tolerated it because she knew it came from love, but she also firmly maintained her independence. She continued her work with the ladies' auxiliary, kept house, and refused to be treated like an invalid. Her belly grew round, and Quincy would talk to it at night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and the mountains and all the things they would do together. "What if it is a girl?" Florence asked. "All your stories are about teaching him to ride and rope." "Then I will teach her to ride and rope," Quincy said. "Our daughter will be able to do anything she wants." The baby came on a cold November night, a month after their first anniversary. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Florence thought she could not endure it. But Quincy was there, holding her hand, encouraging her, and finally the doctor placed a squalling baby boy in her arms. "You have a son," the doctor said. Quincy looked at the tiny red-faced baby with an expression of such awe and love that Florence started crying again. "He is perfect," Quincy whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Florence. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas after Quincy's father, with the middle name of Richard after Florence's father. Baby Thomas was a good child, healthy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Watching Quincy with his son, Florence fell in love with him all over again. He was a devoted father, tender and patient, changing diapers and walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy without complaint. "I never knew I could love anything this much," Quincy said one night, holding his sleeping son. "Except for you. The years that followed were good ones." The ranch prospered. Quincy expanded the herd and bought more land. Florence's closet filled with beautiful dresses, far more than she needed, because Quincy could not resist buying her things whenever he went to town. "I do not need another dress," she would protest. "But you deserve one," he would reply, and that was that. Thomas grew into a lively, curious boy who followed his father everywhere. When he was 3, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret. 2 years after that, another son, James, joined the family. The house that had once seemed too large and empty for one lonely man was now filled with children's laughter, the bustle of daily life, and more love than Florence had ever imagined possible. On their 5th anniversary, Quincy and Florence sat on the porch after the children were in bed, watching the sun set over the mountains as they had done countless times before. "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked. "Marrying a stranger that day?" Florence thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage in a borrowed dress with nothing but hope and desperation. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this porch, to this man, to this life. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me everything I needed and more than I ever dreamed of." "You gave me the same," Quincy said. "I was existing before you came, just going through the motions. You made me live again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Florence said, "Do you remember what you promised me that first day, that you would give me my own room if I wanted it?" "I remember. I never did want it. From the very beginning, even when I was not ready to admit it, I wanted to be with you." "I knew," Quincy said with a smile. "I could see it in your eyes, the same thing I was feeling." "What was that?" "Recognition. Like we had been waiting for each other all our lives and just did not know it until that moment." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, and Quincy put his arm around her. The mountains were turning purple in the fading light, and somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered softly. "Tell me something," Florence said. "If you could go back to that day when you saw me on the street, would you do anything differently?" Quincy was quiet for a moment, considering. "I might have been less awkward in my proposal. Maybe found a more romantic way to ask you to marry me than blurting it out on the street," Florence laughed. "I thought it was charming, honest. What about you? Would you change anything?" "I would have packed more than one carpetbag," Florence said, "but otherwise, no. Every choice I made brought me here, and here is exactly where I want to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside together, to the home they had built, to the family they had created, to the life they shared. The borrowed dress Florence had arrived in was long gone, carefully packed away in a trunk with other mementos of their early days together. But its memory remained, a reminder of how far they had come and how much had changed. Quincy had filled her closet with beautiful dresses, just as he had promised. But more than that, he had filled her life with love, her days with purpose, and her heart with joy. And Florence had given him the same in return, transforming his lonely ranch house into a home, his solitary existence into a rich family life, and his practical arrangement into a love story that would last a lifetime. Years continued to pass, and the Turner Ranch became one of the most successful in the Wet Mountain Valley. Quincy's reputation as a fair dealer and honest rancher grew, and Florence became known throughout the county for her charitable work and her ability to organize the community to help those in need. Thomas, their eldest, grew into a tall boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did. He could ride almost before he could walk, and by the time he was 8, he was helping with the cattle in earnest. Margaret, their daughter, had her mother's practical nature and her father's stubborn determination. She declared at age 5 that she was going to learn to read every book in the house, and by age 7, she had made significant progress toward that goal. James, the youngest, was a cheerful child who seemed to find joy in everything. He loved the chickens best and spent hours in the coop, naming each hen and treating them like pets. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to the cold, dry summers when the grass was sparse, illnesses that swept through the valley, and the constant grinding work that ranch life demanded. But through it all, Quincy and Florence faced everything together. When rustlers stole a dozen head of cattle, they worked with their neighbors to form a watch system. When a prairie fire threatened the ranch, the whole community came to help dig fire breaks and save the buildings. When scarlet fever came to Westcliffe and took several children, Florence and Quincy opened their home to families who needed help nursing the sick. On a spring morning in 1889, 7 years after their wedding, Florence stood in front of her wardrobe, looking at the array of dresses hanging there. She had dresses for everyday wear, dresses for church, dresses for special occasions. She had calico and cotton, wool and silk, plain and fancy. Quincy came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Looking for something to wear?" he asked. "Just thinking," Florence said, "about how different my life is now from what I expected. Good different or bad different, the best different. When I arrived here, I had nothing, just a borrowed dress and a lot of fear. I thought I was coming to be a housekeeper for a cousin I had never met. I never imagined I would find this life. I had given up on finding someone, Quincy admitted. I thought I would grow old alone on this ranch. Then you stepped off that stage and everything changed. Florence turned in his arms to face him. At 29, Quincy was even more handsome than he had been at their first meeting. His face was more weathered from years of outdoor work, with fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But those blue eyes still made her heart skip a beat. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," he replied. "More than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." It had become their saying, a way of acknowledging that their love was not static but growing, deepening with each passing day. That afternoon, Sarah Mitchell came by for a visit. She and Florence had become close friends over the years, and they tried to see each other at least once a week. "I have news," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "John and I are expecting again." "That is wonderful," Florence exclaimed, hugging her friend. "When?" "Late fall, we think." "I am both terrified and thrilled. 3 children seemed like plenty, but I suppose God had other plans." They sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Sarah's oldest boy, William, how to throw a rope. Margaret and James were picking wildflowers with Sarah's daughter. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life," Sarah said quietly. "When we first came out here, I cried myself to sleep every night for a month. I missed Ohio so much. I missed my family, my friends, everything familiar. I thought I had made a terrible mistake." "What changed?" Florence asked. "I did. I stopped trying to make this place into Ohio and started appreciating it for what it was, and I made friends, real friends like you." Sarah smiled. "This place grows on you. The space, the freedom, the feeling that you are building something that matters." "That is exactly how I feel," Florence said. That evening at supper, Thomas asked, "Papa, will the ranch be mine someday?" Quincy exchanged a glance with Florence. Their son was only 8, but he was already thinking about the future. "That depends," Quincy said. "Do you love the ranch? Do you want to spend your life working this land?" "I do," Thomas said firmly. "Then yes, someday it will be yours. You and your brother if he wants to share it. And your sister too if she is interested." "I do not want the ranch," Margaret announced. "I want to be a teacher." "Then you will be a teacher," Florence said, "and a wonderful one." "What about me?" James asked. "You are only 5, Thomas said. "You do not have to decide yet." "I want to be a chicken farmer," James said seriously, and everyone laughed. Later, after the children were in bed, Florence and Quincy stood in their bedroom. It was a far cry from the Spartan room it had been when Florence first arrived. Now it had curtains at the windows, a nice rug on the floor, and personal touches that made it theirs. Quincy opened the wardrobe and looked at the dresses hanging there. "Do you need any new dresses?" he asked. Florence laughed. "Quincy, I have more dresses than I could wear in a month of Sundays." "You have to stop buying me things. I like buying you things. It makes me happy. Then buy me things I actually need. The children need new shoes. James has outgrown his almost completely." "I will buy the children new shoes and you a new dress," Quincy said firmly. "I can do both." Florence shook her head, but she was smiling. "You are impossible. You love me anyway." "I do," she agreed and kissed him. The summer of 1889 brought a drought that tested everyone in the valley. The creek that usually ran full year-round dwindled to a trickle. The grass turned brown and brittle. Cattle grew thin, and everyone worried about having enough feed to get through the winter. Quincy spent long days hauling water from the deeper wells to the cattle. He came home exhausted, face gray with dust, and Florence would have a bath ready and a good meal waiting. "We will get through this," she said one particularly difficult evening when Quincy sat at the table with his head in his hands. "I know. I just hate seeing the cattle suffer. And some of the smaller ranchers are going to lose everything." "Then we will help them," Florence said. "We have more resources than most. We can share." And they did. Quincy opened his wells to neighbors who were desperate for water. Florence organized the church to provide food to families who were struggling. They gave what they could and asked for nothing in return. When the rains finally came in September, washing the valley in blessed moisture, the whole community celebrated. And when the crisis was over, Quincy and Florence found that they had earned something more valuable than money: the deep respect and gratitude of their neighbors. The years rolled on. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and capable, his father's right hand on the ranch. Margaret pursued her dream of teaching, and with Florence's help, she studied hard and eventually passed the examination to become a certified teacher. James, perhaps surprisingly, stuck with his love of chickens and developed a successful side business, raising fancy breeds that he sold to people all over Colorado. Florence and Quincy aged gracefully together. When Florence turned 30 in 1890, Quincy threw her a surprise party that brought together everyone they knew. When Quincy turned 35, Florence gave him a beautiful pocket watch engraved with their initials and wedding date. On their 10th anniversary in 1892, they took a trip, leaving the children with Sarah and John for a week. They traveled to Denver, staying in a fine hotel and seeing the sights of the growing city. Florence bought new dresses in Denver from real dressmakers, and Quincy insisted she get 3 when she had only planned on 1. "Some things never change," she said, exasperated and charmed in equal measure. "I will never stop wanting to give you beautiful things," Quincy said. "You deserve them." But the most beautiful thing he gave her that trip was time, just the two of them, remembering why they had fallen in love and reaffirming their commitment to each other. "If I had known that day when I proposed to you on the street how happy you would make me, I think my heart would have burst from anticipation," Quincy said as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the lights of Denver. "If I had known that day how much I would come to love you, I might have been too terrified to say yes," Florence replied. "It is a fearsome thing, loving someone this much." "Why fearsome?" "Because I cannot imagine my life without you now. You are part of me, as essential as breathing." Quincy pulled her close. "Then we will just have to grow very old together, so neither of us has to imagine life without the other." "Deal," Florence said, and sealed it with a kiss. They returned home to find the children had managed just fine without them, which was slightly disappointing to Florence, who had expected to be missed more desperately. "They barely noticed we were gone," she complained to Quincy. "They are growing up," he said, "becoming independent." "That is what we wanted for them." "I know. I just was not ready for it to happen so fast." Life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm. The children grew and changed. Thomas began courting a nice girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith. Margaret was teaching at the school in Westcliffe and loving every minute of it. James was 15 and already turning his chicken hobby into a profitable business. Florence was active in the community, serving on the school board and organizing charitable efforts. Quincy had become something of an elder statesman among the ranchers, someone younger men came to for advice. In the fall of 1895, Thomas married his sweetheart, Lucy, and brought her to live at the ranch. The house was expanded again to give the young couple their own space. "I remember when it was just you and me in this big house," Quincy said, watching the construction. "And you thought it was too empty and quiet," Florence said. "I do not have that problem anymore," he said with a laugh, as James ran past chasing an escaped hen, with Margaret yelling at him to be careful of her flower garden. Having Lucy at the ranch was a joy. She was a sweet girl, hardworking and kind, and she fit into the family seamlessly. When she announced she was expecting a baby, Florence cried with happiness at the thought of becoming a grandmother. "I am only 35, she said to Quincy. "Is that not too young to be a grandmother?" "My mother was a grandmother at 34, Quincy said, "and she loved it." "You will love it too." He was right. When little Quincy Jr. was born in the spring of 1896, Florence fell completely in love. Holding her grandson, seeing him with his grandfather's blue eyes and his father's dark hair, she felt the circle of life completing itself in the most beautiful way. Quincy was besotted with his grandson. He carved toys for him, rocked him to sleep, and bored everyone with endless talk about how smart and strong the baby was. "You are worse than you were with our own children," Florence teased. "I was working so hard then, trying to build up the ranch. I did not have as much time to just enjoy them, but now I can take the time to appreciate every moment." As baby Quincy grew, the ranch prospered more than ever. The cattle business was good, and Quincy had diversified, raising horses as well. James's chicken business was bringing in surprising amounts of money. Margaret was still teaching and showed no signs of wanting to marry, declaring she was perfectly happy as she was. On a warm summer evening in 1897, 15 years after their wedding, Florence and Quincy sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains glowed pink and gold in the setting sun. In the yard, Thomas was teaching young Quincy how to stack blocks while Lucy watched with a smile. Margaret was reading on the porch swing and James was in the chicken coop as usual. "You ever think about that day when we met?" Florence asked. "All the time," Quincy said. "Best day of my life. You proposed to me on the street after knowing me for 5 minutes. People would say we were crazy. We were crazy, crazy lucky." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring, which had been resized years ago to fit properly. "I promised you I would fill your closet with new dresses." "Did I keep that promise?" Florence laughed. "You kept it so well that I have more dresses than I know what to do with. I have been thinking of giving some to the church to help families who need them." "That is a good idea. You always think of others." Quincy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I promised you dresses, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to look forward to each new day. You took a lonely man and made his life full of love and joy." "We did that for each other," Florence said softly. "I arrived here with nothing but a borrowed dress and a lot of fear. You gave me everything I needed and taught me what it means to be truly loved." They sat together as the stars began to appear, as they had done for 15 years and would do for many more to come. The ranch was quiet now, settling into evening. Inside the house, lamps were being lit. The smell of pine and sage drifted on the breeze. "Tell me again," Quincy said, as he sometimes did. "Tell you what? That you are happy. That you do not regret saying yes to a stranger who proposed to you on the street." Florence turned to look at him, this man who had become her whole world. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth, but to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. "I am happy," she said firmly. "I have never regretted it for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Quincy Turner. Marrying you was the smartest decision I ever made. Even though I keep buying you dresses you do not need, especially because you keep buying me dresses I do not need, it shows you are still thinking of me, still wanting to make me happy." "I will always want to make you happy," Quincy said. "For the rest of my life." The years that followed were good ones. Lucy gave them 2 more grandchildren, a little girl named Florence after her grandmother, and another boy they named Thomas Jr. Margaret eventually did marry, to everyone's surprise, to a banker from Denver who respected her intelligence and supported her continued teaching. They settled in Westcliffe, and Margaret taught until she had children of her own. James married a local girl who shared his love of poultry, and together they built a successful business breeding and selling chickens all over the state. The ranch continued to prosper under the joint management of Quincy and Thomas. They expanded their holdings, bought more land, and became one of the largest ranching operations in the Wet Mountain Valley. But for all the external success, what Quincy and Florence valued most was their family and their love for each other. They had built something that would last beyond their lifetimes, a legacy of hard work, kindness, and devotion that would be passed down through generations. On their 20th anniversary in 1902, their children and grandchildren organized a huge celebration. People came from all over the county to honor the couple who had become beloved figures in the community. Speech after speech praised their generosity, their hard work, their dedication to their neighbors. But the speech that meant the most to Florence came from Thomas. "My parents taught me what love looks like," he said, standing with his arm around Lucy. "Not the easy love of courtship, but the deep, abiding love that weathers every storm and grows stronger with each passing year. My father saw my mother on the street one day and knew she was the one. My mother was brave enough to take a chance on a stranger. Together, they built not just a successful ranch but a home filled with love. They showed all of us what marriage should be." Florence was crying by the time he finished, and Quincy was not far behind. They stood together, surrounded by their family and friends, and felt the overwhelming gratitude of people who had been given far more than they deserved. Later, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, they walked out to their favorite spot on the porch. 20 years, Florence said. "Where did the time go? I do not know, but I would not trade a single day of it," Quincy said. Florence leaned against him and he wrapped his arms around her. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? That when you looked at me you saw someone strong?" "I remember." "I was not strong, I was terrified, I had nothing and no one, I was desperate." "You were strong," Quincy insisted. "Strength is not about having no fear. It is about facing your fear and doing what needs to be done anyway. You had lost everything but you kept going. That is strength." "Well, you made me stronger. Loving you and being loved by you gave me courage I did not know I had." They stood together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. An owl hooted in the distance. The cattle were quiet. The mountains stood silent and eternal against the starry sky. "I never get tired of this view," Quincy said. "Neither do I," Florence agreed. "And I am not just talking about the mountains." He laughed and kissed the top of her head. "Still charming me after all these years." "Always," she said. As they grew older, Quincy and Florence began to slow down, letting Thomas take on more responsibility for the ranch. They still worked, but they also made time to simply enjoy life and each other. Quincy taught his grandchildren to ride and rope, passing on the skills his father had taught him. Florence taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, sharing the knowledge her mother had given her. They took trips when they could, visited Denver, and once went all the way to San Francisco, marveling at how much the world was changing. But they always came home to Westcliffe, to the ranch, to the mountains they loved. On a spring morning in 1905, Florence stood in front of her wardrobe, now filled to bursting with dresses. She had tried to give many away over the years, but Quincy kept buying her more. It had become a kind of game between them, her protesting that she did not need another dress, him insisting that she deserved one. She selected a blue dress, one of her favorites, and put it on. At 45, she was no longer the young woman who had arrived in Westcliffe in a borrowed dress, but she was happy with the woman she had become. Her hair had streaks of gray now, and there were lines on her face, but Quincy still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world. That evening, their children and grandchildren came for Sunday supper, a tradition they had maintained for years. The house was full of noise and laughter and love. After the meal, the adults sat on the porch while the children played in the yard. "I have been thinking," Thomas said, "about building a new barn. The old one is still sound, but we need more space." "Do it," Quincy said. "The ranch is yours now. You do not need my permission." "It will always be your ranch, Papa," Thomas said. "No, it is yours. Mine and your mother's time is passing. This is your time now." Florence reached over and took Quincy's hand. They had talked about this, about aging, about eventually having to let go and trust the next generation to carry on what they had built. "We are not gone yet," Florence said lightly. "We still have plenty of good years left." "Many good years," Quincy agreed. "But when our time does come, we can go knowing we built something that will last." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. More grandchildren were born. The ranch grew and prospered. Westcliffe changed and grew, becoming less of a rough frontier town and more of an established community. Through it all, Quincy and Florence remained devoted to each other. They had grown old together, their lives so intertwined that neither could imagine existing without the other. On their 30th anniversary in 1912, they celebrated quietly, just the two of them. They had a nice dinner, and then Quincy presented her with a gift. "Another dress," Florence guessed with a smile. "Open it and see." Inside the box was a beautiful shawl, hand-knitted from the softest wool in her favorite shade of blue. "It is beautiful," Florence said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I thought you might like something different, although if you want a dress, I can still get you one." Florence laughed. "No, this is perfect. Thank you, my love." They walked out to the porch as they had done countless times over 30 years of marriage. The view had not changed. The mountains still stood eternal and beautiful. The ranch still spread out before them, the result of decades of hard work and love. 30 years, Quincy said. "Feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Florence said. "Sometimes I still feel like that scared young woman in a borrowed dress, and sometimes it feels like that woman was someone else entirely, someone I knew a long time ago." "You were never just scared. You were brave. The bravest person I have ever known. We were brave together, taking a chance on each other, building a life from nothing." Quincy pulled her close, and they stood together wrapped in each other's arms and Florence's new shawl, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I would do it all again," Quincy said. "Every single day, every hard moment, every challenge. I would do it all again for the privilege of spending this life with you." "So would I," Florence said. "You filled my closet with dresses, but you filled my life with love. That is the real gift." They stood together as the stars began to appear, the same stars they had watched on their wedding night 30 years ago. The ranch was quiet around them, filled with the peace that comes from a life well lived and love well earned. Inside the house, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. This house that had been so empty and lonely, when Florence first saw it, was now filled with memories, with evidence of the life they had built together. Every room told a story, every object had meaning. But the most important thing in the house, the most valuable thing they owned, was not any object at all. It was the love they shared, tested by time and proven true, stronger at 30 years than it had been at one. "Come inside," Florence said finally. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," Quincy said. "I'm not ready to go in yet." So they stood a while longer, these two people who had taken a chance on each other so many years ago, who had built a life from nothing but hope and hard work and love. The borrowed dress Florence had arrived in was long gone to dust, but what it represented remained. A new beginning, a leap of faith, a chance taken that changed two lives forever. Quincy had filled her closet with beautiful dresses, just as he had promised. But more importantly, he had filled her life with purpose, her days with joy, and her heart with a love that would last until their final breaths and beyond. And Florence had given him the same in return, transforming his lonely existence into a rich, full life surrounded by family and love. As they finally went inside, closing the door on another beautiful Colorado evening, they knew without having to say it that they were exactly where they belonged, with exactly who they belonged with, living exactly the life they were meant to live. It was, in every way that mattered, a happily ever after. Not the fairy tale kind where everything is perfect and easy, but the real kind, built on hard work and commitment and choosing to love each other every single day. And that, they both knew, was the best kind of happy ending there could ever be.